Hello and welcome to What's Law Got to Do with It, presented by PwC, the podcast where we look to the past and present of our guests and what they think of your future. My name is Jana Ford, and presenting with me today is Victoria O'Toole. Today we're delighted to be joined by Claire Bartram. Claire is a qualified solicitor whom joined the UK Space Agency in 2016. In 2020, Claire was appointed as Director of Space Strategy.
Claire, thank you so much for joining us.
Really lovely to be here. Thank you.
So the first question we have to ask is, what first gave you an interest in the space industry, and how did you know from working as a solicitor and then for the UK government, what made you know that you could have a career in space?
It's a great question. I have been fascinated by space since I was a kid, largely for the reasons that I've been interested in law. I love working out how things work. And consecutively, I just sort of got bigger and bigger as I started working out how different parts of the public sector, for example, started to fit together. How did the health system work? How does national security work? And then naturally started to think a little bit bigger. The wonderful thing about space is that it encompasses everything. It touches on every part of our lives, just in ways that we don't quite understand. So when I was a kid, of course, I'm really inspired by the idea of astronauts, the idea of discovering new things on new worlds. But fast forward to now, I'm really inspired by the idea that space data is a part of every service that we use. It makes our lives better in ways that we perhaps just don't see, that is always there behind the scenes.
When it comes to your first steps into turning that passion, that interest into a career, what were the moments from working in the government that made you know that you could, or made you see the opportunities in there for yourself as not just as an interest, but as a career?
One of the things that I often see when we get letters from members of the public is that they start by saying, I didn't realise that we had a UK space agency. I don't know why we don't shout about ourselves a little bit more as a really important part of the government landscape. When I first joined the civil service, it's true, I didn't know very much about the work that government did in space. The space agency was first created in 2010, so just after I joined the civil service. I didn't know you could be a civil servant and worked in space. I started to pay attention when Tim Peake was in the news. The idea that we would have a British European Space Agency astronaut got me really engaged by the idea that you could have a space career in the UK. When I was at school, I had a careers advisor who asked me when I was about 12 or 13, what did I want to do when I was older? I said I wanted to be an astronaut. And she told me that that was really unrealistic and I should be a lawyer or a doctor instead. The idea that you could have a career in space in the UK and in the public sector is quite difficult really to get your head around, because it's not something that seems very obvious. And so it wasn't until I started looking into it when I started working in government that I saw the work that the UK Space Agency was doing behind the scenes of all of the announcements that I'd seen on the news, whether it's about Tim Peake or about the James Webb Space Telescope. And it was that made me think, you know what, actually as a civil servant, a career in space is really possible, because look at all of this brilliant work that they're doing.
So how can young professionals and aspiring space enthusiasts get involved in the industry, and what sort of skills and qualities do you think are essential for success?
A passion for space really helps, but you don't need to be a space scientist or an engineer. If you are, it unlocks a really fascinating profession for you, but you don't have to have a background in science, technology, engineering or maths in order to work in space. You can be a space lawyer. There are firms that are increasingly creating practices working in the legal services side of space, insurance, finance, logistics and professional services. We talk about space often like it's unique and niche, it's specialist and different. We don't talk about the air or the sea or land in that way. Space is an operating environment like any other. It's a domain in which people operate businesses, people undertake science and research. So exactly the same sorts of professions that you need in order to operate a business on the sea, in the air, on the land, you probably find there's a role for that in space too. So if you've got a career in the arts, and you think, how can I apply that to space? There are individuals that I've met at space conferences who are creating works of art around space exploration. Any interest that you have, there's a role in space for it. I guess you need to just work out, what do you want the most? What interests you the most about space? And therefore, how do you get involved in it? Because in the same way that land and air and sea are very, very broad, just saying space is also pretty massive. The starting question must be, in particular, what really excites you about it?
From having a legal career, what legal issues do you see within your role surrounding space? And what do you think? Do you think these issues will be the same in the future? And what is the UK Space Agency doing to address those types of legal concerns?
So in my day-to-day work, the legal questions that are raised are largely around how government makes investments. So making sure that we are investing in the right way, in the right things, and meeting the duties that we have as holders of the public purse. We also have obligations as members of government that I spend a fair amount of time on, like under the Freedom of Information Act, the Environmental Information Regulations. So a lot of my day-to-day interaction with the law in the UK Space Agency is no different to in any other part of government. We need to make sure that we're following appropriate public regulation in order to do our jobs. Space law specifically is really interesting and something that really affected me when I worked in our spaceflight program. So the first thing that I did in the UK Space Agency was set up a satellite launch program, a program that aims to create spaceflight services from spaceports around the UK. You might have seen that we started operating activity out of Spaceport Newquay in Cornwall. The first question that we had to answer there was, how do we do this legally? How do we make sure that we have safe space operations? It's the first time in the UK that we wish to launch satellites from British soil. What sort of legal framework does that require? It wasn't a huge amount of precedent, but of course we could consider the way in which we regulate health and safety in other areas, the role that the Civil Aviation Authority has, for example, and how that might apply to space. We already had a legal regime which looked at the operation of satellites in orbit. Any satellite that was registered in the UK would be regulated by the UK. How could we apply that then to the launch vehicles that take those satellites into orbit? What extra considerations does that apply? Well, the fact that you go through regulated airspace in order to reach regulated space, and that they're regulated by two different people, start to automatically create new challenges. The international law elements there then come into play, because it's very rare that you would have a launch from the UK that only ever interacts with UK legislation. That launch vehicle is going to start heading over other people's territories, actually other people's airspace or water. What does that mean for the sorts of agreements you need to have in place with those other nations? Started to unpick all of these interesting questions about our international relationships and obligations, our duties under health and safety law, the way in which we regulate safe practice, and how we do that in a way that's also commercially competitive, creating a brand new market in the UK. We're doing this because we think it is a great way to grow space businesses, taking advantage of our unique sector, our heritage and our geography. So we've got to do it in a way that's also attractive to launch operators from around the world to make them want to come to the UK.
Do you think that your training as a solicitor has helped you in sort of unpicking those different legal issues?
Absolutely. I've worked on legislation a few times in different parts of government, and already knowing how to get yourself around reading an act, reading legislation directly, understanding how to work with government legal advisors to convert your intention, what you're trying to get done through the law, into legislative drafting has been enormously helpful. It's been really useful to speak the same language, certainly, but it gives you a shortcut as well so that you have a quicker grasp of what we're trying to do.
I'm curious, in the media, when it comes to those legal questions, a lot of the time, the issue of space debris comes up. And for lawyers, it's such an interesting to talk about the liability, responsibility, or the regulation of space debris. What is the UK Space Agency's response, and what are the the concerns for you when it comes to space debris?
And space is certainly getting increasingly congested as well as contested. Everybody is recognizing the value of operating in space as a part of both the viable business. So we're seeing lots of private operators increasingly wish to launch and operate spacecraft, but also public operators. So other countries and nations continuing to use space as a way in which to support their critical national infrastructure, but also assert their soft power, their influence around the world. It's a way to talk about your national reputation if you have space assets. So the idea that space is going to be increasingly in demand, but isn't getting any bigger, or at least the near Earth orbit environment isn't, does create a number of challenges. You're right that we have obligations as a responsible user of space to ensure that both UK operated spacecraft are following the rules of the road, are operating responsibly, safely and securely, but also that we're leading the way for others to follow and making clear our expectations of the global community. This isn't something that you can manage through domestic regulation alone, because there aren't firm boundaries in space. It's very difficult to ensure that you are protecting your own spacecraft without considering the international implications. A large part of that is managed through our work through the UN. UN Copulus is responsible for ensuring that we have peaceful and safe use of outer space. And we take very seriously our responsibilities as a leading space nation to make clear that we follow appropriate standards and expect others to do so as well.
Can you talk about any sort of memorable experiences you've had in your career within the UK Space Agency?
Similarly. When I was working on the launch program, something that back when I was training to be a solicitor, didn't quite fast forward in my mind to considering that one day I would be in what can only be described as like a combination of a golf cart and a tank. It had sort of tracks that was very flimsy, very open air, with the Secretary of State for Business over a very cratered boggy landscape in Scotland, trying to reach the site of the proposed spaceport that is being developed in Sutherland on the north coast. Really hits home the remote landscape that you really need in order to operate a spaceport safely. It's pretty challenging to get to. It's my first interaction with the Secretary of State at the time. I'm trying to be very professional. I'm holding a conversation in the back of this buggy tank about the importance of our space sector and why it was that we felt that spaceports were such a vital new component. At the time when the buggy got stuck in mud, the tires started to spin and this tidal wave of water hits incoming into that. And I remain professional at all times. I think that's part of what my training as a solicitor gave me, that idea of being unflappable in any scenario.
calm in a storm. Definitely is a legal response. So you're talking about the absolute growth of, you mentioned Spaceport Cornwall and Sutherland Spaceport. This is the growth of the space industry across the whole of the UK. And we've seen the income, the 2023 space industry report showed the income now at 17.5 billion, a growth of $1 billion in a year and in a pandemic year. There was a growth of 1,772 jobs. Clearly, within the space industry, and even your mentioning of the pioneering of small satellites, there's this taking of chances and that going with the growth and excitement for it. How do you think law firms and legal service providers can capitalize on the growth of this industry, and what should they be doing to keep up with the rate that the space industry is growing in the UK?
Great question. The growth is really being propelled by the data revolution, the fact that data is at the heart of so many of the products and services that we rely on every day. And so we can expect that growth to continue. How do legal service providers make sure that they're a part of it? They really need to understand the business, understand what the UK space sector does, how it operates, the services that it requires, in particular, how it can compete effectively in a very contested global landscape. Space is not a domestic industry. It's depends on global supply chains. And so legal service providers thinking about how they can offer services that help UK companies, particularly startups. We've mentioned that there's a large number of new jobs in the UK space sector in the last year. It's a very large number of new organizations associated with those jobs. A lot of that is startups. So how can legal service providers identify the services that startups would really need so that they can compete effectively and go from being largely pre-revenue operations that have a very good idea for research and development, but don't quite know often how to take that to market, to a successful business that can then scale up. That's where, of course, there's a bit of a risk that you look at the numbers. And of course, the number of organizations keeps on growing, the number of jobs keep on growing. Where those are pre-revenue startups, we need to make sure that we're supporting them to then stabilize and then continue to scale up, rather than getting into that place where you have lots of great new ideas, but they can't quite see a way to turn that into profit. That's where having legal service advice can really help.
Curiosity, what is the UK Space Agency's current role, and what are your thoughts about Artemis and Artemis 3 when it comes to the first crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17? It's such an exciting thing currently in the news. What is that scheduled launch for 2025?
We hope, yeah, all being well. First woman on the moon. Very sad it's not me still.
I think everyone's, I'm so
sorry. Yeah, I've not given up hope yet that I'm still in the last year. You never know. But it's thrilling. It's so exciting to understand that the Apollo missions have been so inspiring to many over previous generations. Artemis can be this generation's version. The UK does have a role to play in this, looking at the future of the lunar economy and thinking about some of these brand new markets, which all of these startups are starting to look towards. It's the idea that the services that we provide in space at the moment are about bringing data back down to Earth. How do we use satellites, for example, to bring data back down to Earth that we can use on the ground here? The lunar economy looks to the future. How do we offer services in space to operations that are happening in space? So the UK has an interest, for example, in communication services. How do we make sure that those that are living and working on the moon have access to communication services through their own satellites, not just satellites orbiting the Earth, but satellites orbiting the moon? And what's next? The moon is a staging post for the next journey onto Mars. And how do we ensure then that we're providing the right services so that we can have in, say, 2030 or beyond, the next series of missions to Mars. So the UK's interest is not necessarily in providing the boots on the moon just yet. You never know about the future, but those ancillary services that are so crucial to making sure that operations on the moon can actually happen, we've got a very strong interest in.
What do you view as the long-term goals and ambitions of the UK Space Agency?
We can say that we have three roles at the moment. We catalyse investment, we champion space, we deliver missions and capabilities. By catalysing investment, we make sure that money is flowing around the sector so that research and innovation can flourish in the UK. We deliver the missions and capabilities that we depend on so that satellite services and discoveries from space can help to enrich and empower our lives. And we champion the value of space, whether to customers who didn't even realise that they needed space in their lives, or to investors who didn't know the world of opportunity if they were to only unlock their wallets and put some money into the space sector. Turning that to the future, we think about the next 10 years in space. It will be incredibly important to us that we're managing our space environment well. I mentioned debris earlier. We're removing debris. Stopping creating any more debris, as well as regulating the space environment, is one of our priorities at the moment so that we have sustainable operations. Another is the way in which we use space to protect life on Earth, and that will also increasingly be important as we look at how we can use Earth-observing satellites, those that take images and scans of our planet, to understand climate change and look at ways in which we can reduce our impact on the planet.
I think that's we often, when it comes to space, there's the conversation when it comes to environmental issues is the concern about the carbon footprint of space. I think rarely is it brought up that when it comes to climate change, how space can be used to monitor climate change, how it can be used to broadcast or showcase the issues that we should be addressing. So I think that's very exciting to say that space has a responsibility that it can make use of the environmental issues and to address those concerns in a way that is not just about the actions of the space industry, but to showcase to the broader world what we can be doing.
I think it's more than that too. And the carbon footprint that space has is certainly concerning. It's much less than many other sectors. It's something that we have a responsibility to reduce through, for example, looking at the way in which we can renew the materials that we use. You've seen SpaceX, for example, as an organization that's looking at ways that they can recover their rocket boosters so they can be reused in the future. And you're right that space data helps us to monitor and understand climate change. Over half of all key climate variables are only measurable through space. We must have satellites in orbit so that we can understand climate change. But also space services help us to use less fuel. Space services help us to be more efficient. Think about one of the ways in which we can be more efficient in the future. Smart cities, driverless cars, those will only be possible if we have satellites in orbit. You wouldn't be able to have a driverless car that doesn't rely on some form of position, navigation, or timing signals coming from space. So the answers to these problems, these solutions for the future, depend on space technology.
Okay, well, before we wrap up, Claire, I think the most important question we ask everyone is, did you imagine you'd end up where you are today?
No. I mean, I wanted to be an astronaut, but as I said, I thought that was very unrealistic. No, I loved space. And I never thought that it was a viable career option to me. Equally, when I trained to be a solicitor, I didn't think that I would always be a solicitor. I loved the law and it was fascinating. And I still find it so interesting. It helps me to understand and contextualize why things are the way they are and how things work in the UK. I don't know that I ever thought that I would be a solicitor. I thought that it was a fantastic gateway to other things, and it proved to be so.
Yeah, it is really interesting.
How it touches, and you're so right about how it touches that the idea of not just as the science side, but that within, it's a sector that within it touches everything. And that, the idea that the opportunities there for everyone and not just for scientists or astronauts, I think it's inspiring. Well, I think that is all. Thank you so much for joining us, Claire. It was a delight to chat to you today.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.